Am Yisrael Chai. The Jewish people will live. We struggle to make sense of the terrible pogrom perpetrated against our brothers and sisters in Israel this time last week. To process the loss of life and the suffering inflicted against us, we worry for the scores of hostages taken, and we worry for our family who continues to be under attack. We worry what might come from Israel's other enemies. And we worry for Israel's soldiers who, despite their yearning for peace, must defend our people, our state, and our land. May God be with them, with their families, and with all the citizens of the Jewish state. May God comfort the citizens of Israel, and may God spread over them a sukkot shalom, a canopy of peace and healing. May the shield of Abraham rise up in their defense. This week in Torah, we read the Parsha of Genesis, the beginning. We learn that in a fit of jealousy and rage, Cain kills his brother Abel. That we read this portion every year reminds us that evil is ever present in our midst. Evil is what we witnessed this past weekend with the savage nature of our enemies' attacks on innocent men, women, infants, children, and the elderly. We are horrified and outraged by the slaughter of our people. In God's response to Cain's actions, we learn that evil cannot be ignored, that wickedness cannot be tolerated. And so it is time for our liberal Jewish community and the liberal community at large to finally wake up and recognize what is happening. To all of us who consider ourselves human rights and social justice advocates, me included, to all passionate college students, to all of us who identify as progressives whose mission is a fair and equitable world, know this: what we witnessed this past week has nothing to do with Palestinian justice or freedom. The bloody massacre we saw last week is called a pogrom. Pogroms have been perpetrated upon Jewish people for centuries. What we witnessed was a highly coordinated extermination of Jewish life that we now know was in the works for 2 years. There is no political excuse or justification for it, period. Skipping past quickly sympathy for Israeli victims and moving right along to discussing the plight of the Palestinians is exactly the kind of response Hamas is aiming for. They want their butchering of Jews to be rationalized, justified, and sanitized. They want the resulting global spike in hate crimes against Jews to be ignored. And that's exactly what has been happening slowly over this week. Because the only appropriate response to this pogrom is to call it what it is, what it was, and to condemn it. We can no longer allow murderous evil to masquerade as freedom fighting. If anyone's response to the pogrom is yes, but, then they need to take a moment to ask themselves why the indiscriminate killing of civilians is defensible to them in this one and only case. If it is, maybe it's because they are anti-Semitic. If somebody believes that every human being has the right to live in their own land and live in peace and safety, except for Israelis and Jews, then they are anti-Semitic by definition. Hamas is a terrorist organization whose very existence is predicated on murder and oppression. Their very mission statement calls for the eradication of the state of Israel and all Jews living in the region. Hamas are not freedom fighters. They are an extremist religious death cult. Judaism, on the other hand, holds life in the highest possible value. Israel's military is the only one in the world that is not called an army, but a defense force. Israel's military is the only one in the world who tells everyone, move out of the area. In 24 hours, we're going to bomb here. No other military in the world tells their enemy their plans, exactly when and where they're going to attack. Hamas did not warn Israel at all. And the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, has done this every single time they have attacked a location. They have let it be known publicly and have even dropped flyers from the air prior to the age of the internet. And instead of the world thanking the IDF, thank you for telling us your military operation with 24 hours so that people can move, innocent civilians can move out of harm's way. No other military in the world would ever or has ever done such a thing. Instead of saying thank you, they say, that's not enough time. The only appropriate response to Hamas is a unilateral rejection of mass murder as a political and religious tool. We must finally own and understand that the killing of Jews is not a response to anything. It is Hamas's plan. It has always been Hamas's plan. They are mass murderers who want the extinction of the Jews. They have no moral case whatsoever. It's time for all of us, the entire liberal community, we who have enjoyed the luxury of armchair Middle East activism from the distance and safety of our American homes, to recognize and condemn evil when we see it. We cannot hide behind quote unquote complicated feelings or complicated situations about Israel or about the Israeli government. There are thousands of Israelis and Jews who have been tirelessly protesting in the streets against the Netanyahu regime for years. And they got murdered too. There have been Jews standing up for Palestinians and Palestinians' rights for years. And they got murdered too. This isn't about a political stance. It's about standing up to extremist evil. To those, to any of us who think of ourselves as allies, now is the time to be one and speak up. We, your Jewish friends, your Jewish family, need you. I feel for the plight of the Palestinians. I really do. But the time has come now to place the blame on their situation where it is due, on Hamas. Enough is enough. Here is some history you may not know. In 1988, Hamas published its charter calling for the destruction of Israel. Hamas first employed suicide bombing 5 years later in 1993, specifically a few months before PLO leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords. The historic pact in Oslo established self-government for parts of the West Bank and Gaza under a newly created entity called the PA, the Palestinian Authority. Hamas condemned those accords, for they were not looking for actual independence or statehood. They are not interested in a two-state solution. Hamas also condemned the PLO's and Israel's recognition of each other as entities, even though Arafat and Rabin agreed. In 1997, the United States designated Hamas as a foreign terrorist organization, just like ISIS. And Hamas has been the authority in Gaza since shortly after Israel withdrew from the territory completely in 2005. The following year, Hamas won an election, winning the majority of seats in the Palestinian Authority's legislature, and formed a government in which Palestinians have not been able to vote again in since that time. You don't have to take my word for it. The independent watchdog group Freedom House found in 2020 that the Hamas-controlled government has no effective or independent mechanisms for ensuring transparency in its funding, procurements, or operations. Hamas also controls the Gazan media, civilian activism on social media, the political opposition, and non-governmental organizations, leaving it without any mechanisms for accountability. And Hamas has fired rockets and mortars into Israel since the day the group took power in the Gaza Strip in 2006. Let me ask you this. If a bordering territory or country called for your country's destruction by its very charter and launched rockets into your territory from day one of their regime, would you allow open and unrestricted borders with them? Or would you respond as Israel did, controlling all crossings? Would you cut off all ties? Or would you do as Israel also did, providing power and water and weekly humanitarian aid? while we're speaking about borders, I should remind everyone that before 1967, Gaza was a part of Egypt. And Gaza still borders Egypt on the south. And that border is just as restricted, if not more, than the border of Gaza with Israel. And Egypt provides no power or water or humanitarian aid. Egypt does not allow citizens of Gaza to work in Egypt or immigrate to Egypt. Yet no one ever mentions that when talking about how Gaza is restricted in movement. Why is that? Is it because Egypt is not a Jewish country and does not contain Jews? Maybe. And that's anti-Semitism again. As far as Hamas as a leadership organization in their own area of the West Bank, it has an agenda. And its agenda is not the betterment or support of the Palestinian people. The primary income of Gaza comes from humanitarian and foreign aid. And Hamas could, but chooses not to, use that income to build up infrastructure, not to support the people, and not to provide for their well-being. Rather, Hamas chooses to use most of that income to fund attacks against Israel. They maintain an extensive government-run system of life pensions paid to both terrorists who successfully murder Israelis and to the families of terrorists who died while successfully murdering Israelis. And that those pensions increase for each additional Israeli murder and often greatly exceed the salary received by many Palestinian civil employees, including teachers. In recent years, the annual total of these terrorist pension payments has exceeded $300 million. $300 million paid to kill Israelis. They also use those funds to operate school systems and summer camps that relentlessly indoctrinate Palestinian children in hatred of Israelis and Jews. The schools falsely teach that Israelis are the equivalent of Nazis perpetrating a Holocaust of Palestinian society. And they glorified suicide bombers as the topmost heroes of Palestinian society. The state-run newspapers and television stations convey the same messages across the region. After each successful terrorist murder of one or more Israelis, Palestinian communities across the Gaza Strip erupt in public celebrations to include dancing in the streets, lighting fireworks, firing weapons, and handing out candy to children. All of this is paid for by foreign aid. Just to put it into perspective, the American taxpayers financed aid to the Palestinians in approximately $500 million last year, meaning the terrorist pension payments comprise over half of all U.S. annual aid. This could be money well spent, but it is not. So let us put the blame for the plight of the Palestinian people where it is due, on Hamas itself. It is time. Israel remains the only state in the world that is constantly threatened with extinction by immediate and more remote neighbors. From the onset, the rhetoric is that Israel is chastised when responding to these acts seeking extinction. The response to Israel is that it's chastised for using its disproportionate use of force. This rhetoric is not used anywhere else in the world. It's reserved exclusively for Israel, turning Israel, the victim, into the aggressor. Because Israel is and always has been subject to different standards because it is a Jewish state filled with Jews. From the onset of the Arab-Jewish conflict in the wake of World War I, the Arab states and the Palestinian Arabs strove to prevent the reestablishment of Jewish statehood in the land of Israel, as stipulated by the League of Nations in 1922, and its successor, the United Nations, in 1947. Failing to achieve this goal, they resolved to destroy the nascent Jewish state at birth, not with the purpose, by their own words, of establishing an Arab state on its ruins, but to divide its territory among the neighboring Arab states. In the words of the Arab League Secretary General Abdel Raham Azam, Transjordan's King Abdullah was to swallow up the central hill regions of Palestine with access to the Mediterranean Sea at Gaza. The Egyptians would get the Negev. The Galilee would go to Syria, except the coastal part as far as Acre would be added to Lebanon. They did not at that time call for the creation of a Palestinian state. By contrast, the Zionist movement and the state of Israel has always sought coexistence, both with the surrounding Arab states and with Palestinian Arabs, while at the same time seeking national self-determination. Zionist and Israeli leaders facing geopolitical and demographic constraints and self-imposed normative restrictions have always been willing to compromise on their territorial goals, ranging from the initial acceptance of the two-state solution when it was first evoked in July 1937 by the Peel Commission and again by the UN General Assembly in 1947. In 1947, both the Palestinians and the Israelis were offered land. One, a great, beautiful, big piece of land, and the other, a crappy piece of land. And one group said, yes, thank you very much, we'll take it. And the other group said, no thanks, we want the whole thing. Despite popular opinion, it was the Jews who were offered the crappy piece of land and said, thank you very much, we'll take it and share. And it was the Palestinians who were offered the good and larger piece of land that said, no thank you, we want the whole thing, and instead declared war. And just to remind you, they wanted the whole thing, not to form their own country, but to divide it up among the existing kings and countries. Nobody talks about that. And the idea of a two-state solution was offered and rejected again in the Oslo era. Only on their terms. Viewed from a comparative perspective, Israel's military conduct has been exceedingly restrained, especially in the view of the perennial existential threat it confronts. Yet its right to self-defense, to national existence, continues to be challenged by its enemies' explicit genocidal intentions and indiscriminate practices are ignored and whitewashed. While the inadvertent killing of a single Palestinian civilian in the course of an Israeli counter-terrorist operation can trigger an international uproar, the massacre of over 500,000 Syrians by their unelected ruler, and decades-long repression of the Iranian people by their Islamic rulers are hardly ever news, and you don't know about. Why? Jews are not involved. Now, of course, Israel deserves attention and scrutiny, as does every other nation. But it also merits equal treatment, nothing more and nothing less. But Israel does not enjoy equal status at all. Israel is the only UN member state whose very right to exist is under constant challenge. No one would dare question the right to exist of many other countries whose basis for statehood is infinitely more questionable than Israel's, such as those who were created by brute force, occupation, or distant matchmakers. Just look around. Think about how many nations fit those categories. Why, then, is it only ever open hunting season on Israel? Could it have possibly anything to do with the fact that it's the only Jewish majority country in the world? And that anti-Semitism is as old as Judaism itself, 4,000 years old? Israel's the only country in the world that has won all of its major wars for survival and self-defense, yet is confronted by defeated adversaries and international organizations that insist on dictating the terms of peace. Everyone else, that right is reserved to the winners. Israel is the only country in the world with a separate and permanent agenda item, number 7, at the Geneva-based UN Human Rights Council. No other member state, including serial human rights violators like North Korea, Syria, Iran, and the Sudan, there's no agenda items for them. The only sole liberal democracy in the Middle East is treated this way blatantly and biased because of the way it works. The bad guys circle the wagon to protect one another and at the same time gang up on Israel, creating an automatic majority against it. Israel is also the only country condemned by name out of all the countries in the world as a World Health Organization violator of health. Think about Africa and the AIDS epidemic. Think about the drugs that are being held from people who need them in Sudan. Think about countries who do not give their citizens access to clean water. And yet Israel is the only named country by the World Health Organization, despite the fact that Israel provides world-class medical assistance to Syrians wounded in their own country's civil war, and to Palestinians living in Hamas-ruled Gaza, and has achieved one of the world's highest life expectancy rates for all of its citizens, Jews and non-Jews alike. It is among the very first medical responders to humanitarian crises wherever they may occur all over the world, from Haiti to Nepal. And it's daily advancing the frontiers of medicine for everyone. Yet it's the only country named in my name of the World Health Organization. Why do I have to say it again? Israel is the only state targeted by BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Has anyone seen any significant campus activity that takes aim at true human rights offenders, including some in Israel's neighborhood who behead, forcibly convert, expel Christians, drop chemically laced barrel bombs on civilians, deny Palestinians full right, persecute LGBTQ plus communities, use capital punishment even for minors with abandon, and still perform female circumcision? There's been no movement on any campus to boycott, to divest, or sanction any of those. Why? Do I have to say it again? Given political realities, tackling any of these instances of egregious double standards and blatant hypocrisy can be a daunting challenge. I know some of you are sitting there and disagree with me. But this week has proven that we can no longer be silent, especially when the chief Middle East correspondent of CNN said Israel had it coming. And when the blame for last week's attack is being assigned to Israel more and more every day that we move away from it, even here in our own state. Do you remember the old advertisement for Jewish rye bread? Remember? You don't have to be Jewish to love rye bread. Do you remember that? No one? Yeah, Liebman's. Maybe, was that a New York thing? All right, maybe it was, right? You don't have to be Jewish to love Jewish rye bread, right? You don't have to be Jewish to love a bagel. Well, surely you don't have to be a pro-Israel activist to be troubled by the grossly unjust treatment of Israel this week and in general. We cannot stay silent any longer. All it takes is a capacity for true and equal moral outrage to see the truth as it really is. May we and the entire world see that truth soon. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.